Autosegmental mismatches, part 2, operational mismatch. This one's going to be quicker. And in fact, we already saw an example of it. So I've described operational mismatch as sometimes you can delete segmental features without deleting tones. And we actually just saw that in the Itsako example that we just looked through. Right? We bring together two vowels with different tones on them. One of the vowels deletes, but the tone associated with it doesn't delete. It survives that process and relinks to the following syllable. Highly relevant to your homework assignment, which is about lomongo, the next example on the handout here, number 11. Right? So this particular kind of autosegmental mismatch where segments delete but the tones survive was one of the really important common processes that were found in lots of languages that helped drive the autosegmental theory in the first place in the 1970s. And so how does this work? Here's another example, a very, very similar one from the language Lomongo. It looks a lot like Itsako. And so the isolation forms of these two words, it looks like this is probably going to be morphologically complex words. So probably balongo, it means books, and the ba part is probably a classifier or gender kind of morpheme. And then that next word, bakaye, is probably going to be his, a possessive third-person masculine that agrees in its gender marking with the noun. That part's not super important, just that there's two separate lexical items here, two separate words, each of which has its own tonal specification. So the underlying representations here, do this a little bit lower on the board. Which can presumably be observed in the isolation forms. If you don't put these next to each other, you can observe their underlying representations when you pronounce the words in isolation. And it looks like for these particular words, this is a low, high, high word, balongo, and this is a low, oh, I see, sorry, that's actually a rising tone, high, high word. So this would be something like bakaye, bakaye, balongo, bakaye. Yeah, so this is the input. This is the underlying representations. And just like Itsako, when you bring these two words together in Lomongo, something's going to delete, except in Lomongo, it's much less predictable what exactly deletes. And so I haven't asked you to figure that out on the homework or anything like that. Just take it as a given that some stuff deletes. In this particular case, it looks like the output has the segments balongakaye. And so you could say that this deletes and this deletes. That would be a way of thinking about it. Importantly, the vowel that deletes here was associated with a tonal autosegment, a high tone in particular. So that association line has to be delinked because there's no vowel to anchor it to anymore. And just like in Itsako, we've deleted a segment that was associated with a feature, but the feature is, the tone, an autosegment, but the tone is independent of the segment and doesn't delete. Instead, it shows up on the next syllable. And this makes a super complex tone on this first syllable here. It's a high, low, high, falling, rising tone. So the output here is, I guess that B's gone, so it's balongakaye. But this ah, in particular, ends up having a high, low, high sequence on it. And we write that with triple tonal diacritic. This actually looks a lot like a tilde that we use to indicate nasality. It's not. It's meant to be high, low, high tone. And that's what we get in the output because of the reassociation of this floating H tone with the following syllable. So again, segmental features delete, but the tones associated with them don't necessarily delete. They can, but in these particular cases, they don't. Right? And so this is showing us again that tonal autosegments, the tone tier here, is somewhat independent of other features of the segmental tier. The opposite case here is where tones delete, but the segmental features that they were associated with don't delete. They survive. The example here is from phrasal phonology, right? So it's like a whole verb phrase here. This particular example is from Haya. This is also very common in Bantu languages. So this is a pretty complex verb form. A lot of these languages are polysynthetic, where they have lots and lots of inflectional affixes that you can use to construct meanings that might be a whole sentence in an Indo-European language. So in particular, probably in this form, bako mela. So this is high, low, high, low, low. Probably the ba part is going to be a verb stem, and then everything else will be a series of suffixes. I don't know exactly where the boundaries are, but what it means is something like they tied it up for it. Right? So it's going to be the verb tie with a bunch of suffixes that mean third person plural subject, third person gender neutral direct object, and then a benefactor. That's the for paraphrase here. There's going to be a bunch of suffixes. Anyhow, in isolation, you get high tones on these first three vowels. And we assume that that's because there's either a single high autosegment or maybe three separate ones. At this point in the class, doesn't really matter. We can just call it one autosegment. And then presumably there could also be a low autosegment here. It looks like the way this has been transcribed, there's a claim here about the phonology. This is from Larry Hyman again. In some languages, spreading and other kinds of tonal autosegmental processes work with H's and with L's. In other languages, it looks like the phonology only cares about H's and everything else gets realized as a low tone, but the L autosegment doesn't seem to play any role in the phonology. These are sometimes referred to as unary versus binary feature languages for two-toned languages. The claim here seems to be that this is a language where the low tone is phonologically inert, meaning that you don't need to even represent it. L is just the elsewhere tone. Now, this is not super important for our point here, but that's why there's no tonal diacritics on these syllables. It's because they get default low tone, and we don't need to put the autosegment in here. Though for this process we could, it wouldn't hurt anything. But let's just leave it like this. We have a high tone associated with the first three syllables here. And the observation is that when you add an overt benefactor object here, so kato in this case, which is a proper name, high-low, within some large phonological phrase that includes a verb and its arguments, this is going to be a prosodic phrase of some sort, all of the tones preceding the final word delete. Right? So these become all low in this context. How would you have to do that? You'd have to delink all of the tones in this example. This would leave this thing floating to get deleted at the end of the phonology because it's not associated with anything. And the output then is going to be no tones at all on this word. And we don't actually need that low tone there because remember we said low tone is phonologically inert in Haya. And so the output is going to be just this high tone associated with this one syllable. Everything else has been deleted, so everything else in the phrase will get low tone. And it comes out something like ba'a come la kato. And so, again, you can see here the tones from this first word, from the verb form, are getting deleted, but the segments that they were associated with in the input survive. Right? So you can delete tones without deleting their associated segments. You can delete segments without deleting their associated tones, and that's operational mismatch. The particular case where segments delete but tones survive is referred to as tonal stability in phonology.